Tired of your car insurance rate going up even with a clean driving record? You're not alone. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/ACAST today.
Amazon One Medical presents Painful Thoughts.
I've been on hold to make a doctor's appointment for 23 minutes now. The automated voice has told me 47 times that my call is very important to them. I'm starting to think that they don't think my call is important at all.
With Amazon One Medical 24/7 virtual care, you'll get help fast without having to remain on the line to make an appointment. Amazon One Medical. Healthcare just got less painful.
Hello and welcome to episode number 303 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Laura Bullock, Mimi Grandma 2021, Liz Evans, Steph East 2, Liz Hay, Sean Porter, Charlotte, and Urazi. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week. Our film review is The Long Walk. The Long Walk was released in 2025. It has 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb and 88% on Rotten Tomatoes. A group of teenage boys compete in an annual contest known as The Long Walk, in which they must maintain a certain walking speed or get shot. So this is another Stephen King adaptation, and as far as I'm aware, he wrote it when he was like 18, which is mad. Like, to be 18 years old and write something like this. Now, I've not read it, but I have to say watching this film did make me really want to read it, because I know there are some differences between the film and the book, as there inevitably often are. And I think the ending of the film is slightly different than the book. And I just really wanted to read the book when I came away from this film, which I think is pretty high praise, right? And in this film, right, these young men, they end up in a lottery to compete in the Long Walk. So I think the implication is that it is voluntary, like you volunteer to do the Long Walk and you can withdraw if you want, but due to circumstances of like desperation, etc., lots of people volunteer for it. They end up in a lottery, and if you get picked, there are 50 young men who have to do this walk. And if they walk of a speed that is below 3 miles an hour, they get a certain number of warnings before they just get shot. And we see in the film that it is televised, so the nation is watching this happening, right? And it does feel incredibly dystopian and particularly awful. And I genuinely, philosophically really enjoyed it. And within the kind of the scope of the film, you get to know some of the characters that are doing this long walk. And we have two main characters and then kind of subsequent characters who they come into contact with. And you really get to know them. And I have to say, like, I was genuinely rooting for these characters. And this sense of brotherhood and camaraderie that develops throughout the film is gorgeous. And also what I think was really interesting is this sense of brotherhood and camaraderie that develops, but it like builds and it wanes, and it's like a roller coaster. Sometimes it's there, sometimes they're all laughing and singing and having a good time, sometimes they're fighting almost to the death with each other. And that to me felt really, really engaging to watch, because it wasn't just, oh, look at these poor young fellas having to do this walk. Like, some of them are deeply dislikable. You're watching them and you're like, oh, you're a dickhead. And it's not just boys against the system, because they fight with each other. They're, you know, they have different opinions about the system and how the system works. And it is just fascinating to watch these characters develop over time. And the two main characters, I thought we were watching this gorgeous love story play out. And it was really beautiful because it really did feel like a love that grew between the two of them. And I don't necessarily mean a romantic love. I just thought that they bonded together and they just came to rely on each other and care about each other. And they have this unflinching loyalty to each other that they develop. And it made my heart sing to watch it. And then I felt kind of devastated that I knew, a lot of these boys are going to die, and, you don't know when they're going to die. But obviously, because of the nature of the story, it's inevitably going to happen. And in the film, Mark Hamill actually plays the Major, who is the man who is overlooking all of this, and obviously the direct representation of this dystopian system that is at play. And I thought he was really cartoonish as a villain, but I thought that it really worked because you sort of have this over-the-top, cartoonish, horrible man that is just a representation, really, of the governmental systems that are at play. And let me tell you, it felt pretty on point for our world today in a very strange way. And I really liked his performance. It's completely like over the top and like I said, cartoonishly bad man-esque. But it was enjoyable to watch. And I also really liked the landscape. So they're walking along this road and it is bleak and it is desolate, and every so often you realise there's like children on the side of this dusty road watching people getting shot and killed, and it all just feels really bleak. And then you have these moments of pure joy from the young men that are doing the walk that is completely incongruous with this really bleak and desolate landscape. And I think there are people who will watch this film and they'll really dislike the feeling of ambiguity about the story, right? But I personally enjoyed not knowing. We know there's been a war. We know that as a result of this war, there's been a ridiculously steep economic downturn and everyone is struggling. And I saw a lot of chatter online about like, this is stupid. Why would anybody want to do this? And I sort of think that is answered in the film. There are some characters who have like really personal reasons for wanting to do the long walk, right? That are particular and that have a definite goal in mind, right? But there's other characters who are just like, I have nothing else. What have I got to I literally have nothing to lose, so why would I not do this? And that I thought was a really interesting way to pitch it. Which brings me to my dislikes of this film, right? And I'm going to be really clear about this. I am aware of the practicalities of long distance sports, right? I run half marathons pretty regularly, and I have seen people shit on the side of the road during long runs. I have to say, and I'm going to be honest, it's never happened to me yet, and I count myself very lucky that it hasn't happened to me, but I've seen it happen. It inevitably happens. You're on a long walk, you're going to be walking for literally days on end, potentially. You are going to need to go to the toilet at some point. I get it, okay? But the amount of times in this film that we saw a young man defecating, I thought, you know what? I don't want to see another human being defecating. I just don't want to see it. And it just felt to me that it was really indicative of the fact that this was written by a teenage boy. And the fact that we saw it so often in the film also said to me, how many times are people shitting in this book? Because it must be constant. There was one death in particular, and it was honestly all I could think about for ages after the film, because I thought the indignation of that death. I mean, based on what I've been talking about in the last 20 seconds, I think you can imagine the state in which that person was when they met their demise. And, the indignation just killed me. Honestly, it was rough. But we definitely didn't need to see it again and again. And moving on from that, I think that this film was quite slow to get going. It wasn't until maybe like the midway point that I really became more engaged with the film and more engaged with the characters. And I really, like I said, felt like the two central characters and their burgeoning love story was divine. I loved it. And I really enjoyed the other characters in the story, but I kind of wanted more. Like, I wanted to know more about them. They seemed a bit two-dimensional to me, and I understand that you've got all of these characters in this story. You're trying to fit it in a particular time frame. I mean, in the book, there's 100 boys I keep saying boys, they're kind of young men, but in the book there's 100 young men, and in the film there's 50. And like, I get it, you can't give every character a massive backstory, but I wanted to know more about them. And I'm kind of aware that I gave Shelby Oaks 3 stars last week. I feel like that was too trigger happy. I was a bit fixated on this I want independent horror films to be pushed to the fore narrative. So I feel like Shelby Oaks 3 stars was probably too generous. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I feel like The Long Walk is a 3.5 star film, but I don't think it's only half a star better than Shelby Oaks, right? I thought Shelby Oaks was probably a 2.5, really. But this film, The Long Walk, is a 3.5. I would recommend watching it, but I also would like to point out that there are a lot of repetitive kills in this story that to me felt like it was kind of running on shock value a little bit, and it gets a bit, I just don't want to see another boy getting shot in the face, you know what I mean? So just brace yourself, do a bit of a does the dog die search on this film. Maybe make sure that you're in the frame of mind to watch it before you watch it. But is it good? Yeah, maybe you want to read the book, so that's a pretty good thing.
In a world where January is supposed to be boring, one staple of the holidays refuses to end. The great deals at Verizon. The joy just keeps on coming. Right now, you can save on 4 new phones and 4 lines. Critics agree it's the deal that keeps on giving. Come into Verizon and save on 4 new phones and 4 lines on unlimited welcome. Additional terms apply. See Verizon.com for details.
Feeling heavy and depleted after the holidays? Prolon's 5-day fasting mimicking diet makes it easy to reset your body, habits, and energy heading into the new year. Developed with USC's Longevity Institute, Prolon is a nutrition program that works at the cellular level to rejuvenate you from within, supporting fat loss, glowing skin, and sharper focus. It's a simple, science-backed way to turn intentions into action. No injections, no guesswork, just real results. Get 15% off plus a bonus gift when you subscribe at prolonlife.com/start. That's prolonlife.com/start.
Hi, it's Matt here from P1 with Matt and Tommy, and this episode is sponsored by eBay. Ever tried to buy a car online and end up in a parking lot with a stranger, a paper title, and some blind trust? With Secure Purchase on eBay, you don't have to. Secure Purchase means sellers and titles are verified. Financing covered. Registration handled. Delivery, get your ride, plates and paperwork shipped to you so you can skip the DMV and sketchy meetups. Buy your next car on eBay. eBay. Things people love. Secure Purchase is powered by Caramel Dealer Services LLC, an eBay subsidiary.
If you're the purchasing manager at a manufacturing plant, you know having a trusted partner makes all the difference. That's why, hands down, you count on Grainger for auto reordering. With on-time restocks, your team will have the cut-resistant gloves they need at the start of their shift. And you can end your day knowing they've got safety well in hand. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Which brings us to our story this week. And for our story this week, we are going all the way to the Czech Republic. So let's get into it. About an hour's drive north of Prague, and nestled just shy of the border between the Czech Republic and Germany, sits Houska Castle. Perched on top of a sheer limestone cliff, Houska looms over a practically untamed wilderness of nearly impenetrable forests and thick, muddy swamps. It was built sometime between 1253 and 1278, during the reign of Ottokar II of Bohemia. And from the moment the very first stone was laid for construction, and all the way forward to today, something about the castle just hasn't seemed right. Locals back in the 13th century, and many to this day, avoid the castle and the cliff that it was built upon, and their folklore is littered with cautionary tales about strange things that happen in this unusual location. The people there know about the uncanny noises and the flocks of birds that seem to drop dead as soon as they enter the courtyard. But all of that aside, the people of the 13th century had little to no reason to venture onto the land of Houska Castle in the first place. There was no game to hunt and no vital herbs or crops that could grow on the marshy land that surrounded it either. There were no trade routes that ran through the pass or a border to protect it. There was absolutely nothing to draw anyone in. And yet, the castle was still built on that cliff, and it appears that it was used as well. Behind the thick stone walls is an atrium, a drawing room that could house and entertain several knights, and a chamber that has been decked out in various late Gothic paintings. There's even a chapel, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. Because especially in comparison to the time when it was built, the sprawling rooms of Houska Castle all seem to lack one very vital amenity: a place to sleep. Now, that is not to say that people didn't spend the night at Houska. They most definitely did, and it would certainly have been possible. But it doesn't seem like the castle was built with the idea of a lord and their family occupying it for extended periods of time. There's no place to grow crops or food to feed those staying in the castle. There's no source of running water or even a well. In fact, the only source of water is a cistern underneath the castle that can only be filled by rainwater. There isn't even a kitchen. Everything needed for those staying behind the walls of Houska would have to be brought with them, and that simply wasn't conducive to housing a ruling lord, his family and their staff. No, it appears that from the get-go, Houska Castle had a very different function to other castles and fortresses that have been built throughout our collective history. At first glance, and the more widely accepted explanation for the need to build the castle in the first place, the rooms and halls of Houska appeared to be more like offices. This castle, rather than being a strategic and defensive building, functioned as a place to conduct business and hold important meetings that would determine the fate of the realm. At least, that was Houska Castle's function on paper. In reality, things were quite different. Houska was still surrounded by thick forests and dangerous marshland. Yes, there were local villages who eked out a living in this unforgiving wilderness, but these villages were not particularly important to the overall success of Bohemia as a whole. As I've mentioned before, there were no trade routes going through the area, and its only claim to any sort of strategic importance was that it was a few miles away from the border to Germany. All in all, there seemed to be very few reasons to build Houska, and yet the building continued to change hands throughout the centuries and very rarely went unused. In the late 16th century, it was renovated with Renaissance-style modifications, and by 1639, it had been claimed by one particularly unsavoury character. This was in the time known as the 30 Years' War, when peasants all across Bohemia had risen up in an attempt to overthrow the ruling Habsburg family. It was then that a vicious Swedish mercenary by the name of Oronto gathered his men and seized Houska Castle. From his new vantage point, on the top of the overlooking cliff, Oronto and his men terrorised the local population and kept his ill-gotten goods inside the castle. But the fear the people of Houska felt towards Oronto only had something to do with the terrible way he was exploiting them, and had far more to do with Oronto's dark reputation. It was well known, you see, that Oronto was a dark sorcerer. After claiming the castle for himself, Oronto had set up his alchemist's workshop, where he experimented day and night, searching for the elixir of everlasting life. He and his men had to be stopped at all costs. The people of Houska knew that, just like they knew that he would reign over them and their children forever if they couldn't get rid of him before he discovered the elixir. So the story goes, two brave hunters risked the journey up to the castle in the dead of night. Blindly, they began shooting arrow after arrow in through the castle windows, but it would turn out that fate was on their side. By chance, they had found the windows to Oronto's workshop, and their arrows had struck home. Oronto was killed, and the good people of Houska were spared. The castle continued to change hands for a few more centuries before being bought up by a man named Joseph Simonek in 1924. It is still his descendants who own the castle today, and it was from his family that Houska Castle was seized by Germany back during the Second World War. Most of the documentation for what the Nazis were doing at Houska was destroyed as they retreated from Allied forces. But so the rumours go, Houska was the base for top-secret medical experiments that may or may not have included aspects of the paranormal. And it's here that we can get to the heart of why many believe Houska was such an important castle and why it was built. So, keeping that in mind, let's look at the castle itself again. There is no water. There is no kitchen. In terms of fortifications, there's nothing external. Yes, there were a few towers and embankments that were taken down during the renovations, but nothing that would have made the castle particularly safe from enemy forces. In fact, if the original plans are correct, it was only those towers that connected the upper floors of the castle to the courtyard, and there was no way to travel from one floor to the other from inside the castle itself. Not even the windows are real. Granted, some of them are, but most of the windows and some of the doors that can be seen from the outside are quite literally fake. The closer you look, the stranger Houska Castle gets. Stranger still, the original plans for the castle revealed the fact that many of the original fortifications faced inwards instead of out. Almost like the people of Houska were attempting to protect themselves from something within the castle walls. And who could blame the architects for that, when the castle is rumoured to be built right on top of a gateway to hell? The stories about the gateway go back even further than the history of the castle itself. Archaeological evidence puts Celtic tribes in and around the area until it was taken over by Slavic tribes around the 6th century. It was hundreds of years later that the first known structure was built near the site of Houska Castle, though it was only a small wooden fort. And yet, an author of a very extensive Czech chronicle from 1541 felt the need to not only mention the structure, but to go into the legends that surrounded it. In his book, Vaclav notes that the limestone cliff at Houska is marred by a strange crack. This crack then opens into an incredibly large pit, the bottom of which can't be seen. The villagers report that they often hear strange noises coming from that pit, especially at night when whatever lives down there screams and cries like the pit is being filled with hundreds of people being tortured. The hole to hell, they dubbed it, as they cautioned everyone to stay far away. In the centuries that the Slavic tribes had lived in the area, they'd seen all manner of beasts and creatures come crawling out of that pit. Most were half animal, half human, and were known to steal livestock and children or anyone who passed by at the wrong time. Those who were dragged down into the pit by these strange creatures never returned, or if they did, they came back half beast, just like the monsters who had taken them. For generations, the villagers at Houska had attempted to fill the pit in themselves, but no matter how many rocks they threw down into the darkness, nothing ever changed. In an attempt to solve the mystery and perhaps slay the monsters that were attacking their village, the Lord offered a deal to a prisoner awaiting execution. If he would agree to be lowered into the pit and recount everything he witnessed down there, the prisoner would be pardoned. The prisoner agreed and was strapped into a set of ropes before descending into the pit. At no point did he call to signal that he'd reached the bottom, but he did make it clear that he had seen something. The prisoner began screaming, and was clearly terrified by whatever it was that he was witnessing. He was down further than anyone had ever been before, so it took an age to haul him back up. But he wasn't gone that long, not really. And yet, when the man returned, his skin was sagging and wrinkled, and his hair had turned bright white. A young man had entered the pit, and an old one had returned. He had also gone mad. The prisoner was practically incoherent and refused to answer any questions about what he had seen down inside the gateway. He was tended to at the estate, but died a few short days later from unknown causes. It seems the hole to hell had kept its secrets. It was in 1846, a couple of 100 years after this poor prisoner's fate, that Czech poet Karl Hynek Mácha stayed the night at Houska. Of course, now the castle had already been built, but still the pit called to Karl. He later claimed that he had been dead asleep in the middle of the night when he felt his soul being pulled from his body and dragged into the awaiting darkness below. Somehow he then found himself transported to Prague, to the year 2006, and was able to accurately describe what the future looked like in a letter to his friend. Karl claimed to have met a young woman who had showed him moving pictures in what appeared to be a small casket. He gave details of locations in modern-day Prague that hadn't even been conceptualised yet. But then, come daybreak, he awoke back in 1836 and left Houska before he could be unwillingly transported in time again. And the Houska castle that Karl returned to is the one that still stands today. The wooden structure has been updated and fortified to the stone castle first built in the 13th century and had seemingly been placed on that limestone cliff for one very important reason. It had everything to do with the hole to hell. After the poor prisoner came back aged and mad, the people of Houska realised there was only one thing strong enough to keep the power of the pit in check, and that was God himself. Ground was broken on the castle fortification, and across the pit stretched the chapel I mentioned before. There was no filling in the pit, but the chapel would seal it. Stone and mortar laid across the infamous crack in the limestone cliff, laying the foundations for the chapel that would then be dedicated to the Archangel Michael. In the Bible, it was Michael who had led God's armies against Lucifer and the demons of hell, and in Houska, the people were calling on Michael once again to keep hell at bay. You can see images of Michael in the frescoes that line the chapel walls. Frescoes that are quite like any other in Christendom. They are some of the oldest in Europe and date back to the early 1400s. In one scene, Michael is fighting a dragon, which is often considered to be the symbol of evil. In another, Michael holds a sword in one hand and a set of scales in another as he weighs the soul of humanity on Judgment Day. In other frescoes are scenes of the crucifixion and Saint Christopher. And in one is a particularly strange creature. She is half woman, half horse, a centaur, who holds a bow in her hand and aims her arrow at a human figure. Not only is she a symbol of paganism, but she is also clearly left-handed, which in the Middle Ages was a trait that was closely related to the devil himself. Here we are seeing the legends of the hole to hell play out all over again in the shape of half-human, half-animal satanic creatures. It is only through the combined strength of God and the Archangel Michael that the chapel at Houska Castle has kept the forces of evil at bay. But that's not to say that the chapel hasn't been tested. So the stories go, the walls of the chapel are always wet, despite the fact that there are no sources of water nearby, and even when droughts have drained the surrounding marshland below. Witnesses have also claimed to hear what appear to be screams and cries coming from beneath the stone floor of the church, like there are beings trapped underneath it, or the demonic creatures are trying to claw their way back out. Spirits are often seen walking around the castle. Shadow people stalk the halls. A creature that seems to be part human and part bulldog can be found hiding inside the building, and the spirit of a headless ghost is said to wander the courtyard, blood still gushing out of the wound on its neck. Some say that simply visiting the castle brings bad luck and misfortune. Some people have turned away without ever stepping foot inside after being struck by a terrible feeling that something is wrong with the place. Others have ventured in and wished that they never had. Owners of the McGee's Ghost Tours in Prague, Hannah and Tyler McGee, once visited Houska with their dog Bobo. Upon entering the courtyard, Hannah was afflicted by an ominous feeling of unease. She wasn't the only one of their party to sense this either, as Bobo started barking and pulling on the lead like he was trying to get away or interact with something Hannah and Tyler couldn't see themselves. Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But still the McGees finished their guided tour and then headed back to Prague to guide a tour of their own. Many times before they had parked their car in the city centre and never had there been a problem. But that night Hannah and Tyler returned to find that their vehicle had been stolen. It only took the police a few hours to recover their car, but by then all of the McGees' valuables had already been taken and their vehicle had been trashed. They believed that whatever bad energy they experienced in the castle had followed them home. And before we finish this out, let's not forget the Nazis who took control of the building during the Second World War. We may not know what they were doing on the premises, but what we do know is that Hitler was interested in the paranormal and ordered several experiments on how to utilise and exploit supernatural abilities. Is it too far of a stretch to imagine that he would have been drawn to the legends of a portal to hell and wanted to find out more? Answers for that question in particular, however, may be hard to find. The current owners of Houska Castle are in the midst of extensive renovations. But once the Simonek family were able to recover the property from the Nazis, they discovered that the place had been littered with landmines and explosives. It took a long time to clear the grounds, but there was no guarantee that the Nazis hadn't rigged the pit with explosives before retreating, and there would be no recovery from an explosion inside the very cliff that sits beneath the entire structure. The castle itself has been open to the public, but the pit remains sealed, and the Simonek family has banned any excavation for fear that it could bring the whole castle down by mistake. So here's what I'm going to say from the off, right? Because when you read about Houska Castle, the supernatural Nazi experiments stories always come up. And I used to be quite interested in what that meant. I was like, what were they doing? Like, what were these paranormal experiments that they were doing? And I do think that we have to be kind of careful about what we actually mean when we talk about the Nazi regime doing paranormal experiments, right? Because in my head, I thought people were referring to, like, you know, the opening scene of Hellboy, where they're literally trying to open portals to hell, etc., etc. And you're like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, how were they doing these things? Where were they doing these things? But actually doing the reading, it seems that their kind of paranormal experimentation, and I'm doing that in inverted commas, was actually about finding justifications for their absolutely abhorrent theories about race, right? So they were kind of looking up folkloric, mythological and pseudoscientific stories and pseudoscientific ideas that could justify the absolutely disgusting narrative of the Nazi regime. And interestingly, it seems that Hitler himself, according to what I read, wasn't particularly interested in the paranormal. I think the interest actually more so seems to have come from Himmler himself, who, if you don't know, was a high-ranking Nazi official. And there are lots of stories, lots of conspiracy theories, lots of bits and pieces in films, etc., that reference the Nazi regime literally doing crazy paranormal experiments. There is that episode of Love, Death and Robots where those pilots are sent in to bomb a church and they don't really know why they're doing it, and then it unleashes some crazy evil that the Nazi regime has been trying to harness. There's, like I said, the beginning of Hellboy and the kind of, you know, subsequent film of Hellboy, where there are officers that are trying to they're trying to like unlock a portal to hell. There's all this crazy stuff going on, right? We see it in comic books all the time, etc. But I think it's important to bear in mind that what the Nazi high-ranking officials were doing was just trying to find ways to legitimize and justify their hideous, disgusting actions. And I've often had like half a mind to do an episode about those weird supposed Nazi supernatural experiments, but actually I kind of don't want to. Do you know, at this point in our current political climate, I think trying to spookify the Nazis is kind of not really the way to go, you know. But aside from that, we're moving on. I'm not mentioning the Nazis again. We're moving on. I want you to stop what you're doing and look up a picture of Houska Castle, right? Just put it into Google, look at the Google images, because it is a weird place. And it's literally on a cliff edge. Like, that's no exaggeration. It is literally on a cliff edge. It's this square castle that is all fortified inwards. It's odd. It's weird. You know, I like it. It is kind of mind-blowing, to be honest. It's not self-sustaining. Like I said, the villages that were around it, they weren't particularly important, so they didn't need to be controlled or monitored in a really significant way. It's just a really strange place. And the fact that it has like no running water, it has no bedrooms, no kitchen, it wasn't designed for living in. Even if it was designed to house, you know, whatever the equivalent of business meetings was, you would imagine that it would then have sleeping quarters and kitchen quarters, because lords of the land, etc., would travel for those meetings, right? And you'd want to be able to feed them. You'd want to be able to house them overnight. It's just very strange. And as I mentioned, the Habsburg family in this story, I would highly recommend doing a deep dive into the Habsburg family, because their story is wild and interesting. And you probably will have heard of the Habsburg jaw and Charles II of Spain, who was the result of years and years and years and years of chronic inbreeding. And there is also the suggestion that the descriptions of his physical appearance and the subsequent autopsy on his body after he died are likely to be, you know, somewhat exaggerated by the enemy, as it were, which happens throughout history. We know that. But the Habsburg family, throughout 200 years of rule across Europe, oh my God, is it an interesting story. So if you want a rabbit hole to go down, I would highly recommend it. And I think places like this exist in lots of remote communities, right? Places where there's mystery surrounding it. There is said to be an evil force or a drive that will take your life. We hear it all the time in stories about Indigenous people. And generally these stories are ignored, or they're seen as ridiculous until people start dying, right? But it seems that the people around Houska, they seem to have taken this seriously, right? Whatever was going on in that pit, do I think it's the gateway to hell? No. But do I think it freaked the people out? Probably yes. The noises that came from the pit could genuinely just be as simple as something physical happening to the rocks within that pit. So whether it was a cave system underneath, or whether there was wind howling through it, and that was making the sounds of screaming and animal noises and sounds like people were being tortured coming from the hole. Like, it could have been as simple as that. But if you're a villager, right, back in the day, mooching around, and when it gets dark at nighttime and windy and you're hearing the sounds of screaming coming from this fissure that's in a rock face that nobody can get to the bottom of, yeah, I'm going to be pretty freaked too, to be honest. And we also know that there are and were animals on the European continent that were large enough to steal animals, children, etc. And these stories of like half animal, half human creatures dragging themselves out of this pit could have simply been used to scare children enough to keep them inside, you know? And if the people really did believe that there were creatures coming out of this crack, this fissure, this hole to hell, as they called it, if the villagers really did believe that, then maybe it was as simple as a lord of the area was like, listen, I hear your concerns, you're freaking out, let's do something about it. So that was why they then ended up building this castle over it in order to protect the villagers or just simply make them feel at ease. And I do think the legend of the prisoner being lowered down into the hole is likely to be a bit of a spooky add-on to the story. And I appreciated it. I enjoyed it. You know, whatever he saw, it made him go white with shock, or his hair went white and he came back completely wrinkled, and then he, you know, died a couple of days later and he had gone mad, you know, so he was never able to actually say what he saw in the pit, but it had clearly terrified him so much. Now, do I believe that building a chapel over this crack in the land is the reason why nothing has emerged from it? No. Do I believe that that probably put people's minds at ease? Yes, I do. Do I think that Karl Hynek Matcha was a time traveller? No. But do I think his story is cool? Absolutely yes. I think it's important to remember that what he described to his friend was a dream. You know, he described it as a dream, and he had a dream about Prague in 2006. Maybe he did, which is really interesting. Do I think it's something to do with the fissure or that crack? Probably not. I really do think that this is like a perfect bit of spooky location-based folklore, and I absolutely love it. I love these stories about somewhere where there's this hole to hell. You know, nobody knows what's down there. Nobody knows how far it stretches. Could it be the hole to hell? Are there creatures emerging from it at night time? Possibly. It scared the life out of villagers hundreds of years ago. And I think that those kind of enduring legends are really fascinating. And I think it's demonstrative of our connection to the land itself, how much folklore and story is held within the land that we live on. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And if you have a spooky story that you would like to send in, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or for $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
In a world where January is supposed to be boring, one staple of the holidays refuses to end. The great deals at Verizon. The joy just keeps on coming. Right now, you can save on 4 new phones and 4 lines. Critics agree it's the deal that keeps on giving. Come into Verizon and save on 4 new phones and 4 lines on unlimited welcome. Additional terms apply. See Verizon.com for details.